on TRE. Talk Radio Europe.
Now, from Commanding Officer of the RAF's Aviation Medicine Training Centre and Head of Division at the Institute of Aviation Medicine, pioneering safer systems for aircrew, all the way to the ITN studio team during the Apollo space programme in the 1970s. The ups and downs of an aerospace doctor. We're going to talk to a man now who knows all about it, Gordon Sharp. Good morning, Gordon.
Good morning, Bill.
Thank you for joining us. Your route into this it kind of came out of a disaster, really. We're talking here back in the war, aren't we, when you were a young boy growing up in Glasgow and Clydebank received an awful bombing.
Well, that's exactly right. It was the night of the Blitz, and unfortunately both my parents' house and my grandparents' house took a couple of landmines and were more or less flattened. Fortunately, they were unhurt, but I received quite a nasty gash to my leg and was very impressed by the doctors and nurses and people giving first aid who really put me so much at ease. And it was at that point, Bill, that I decided, implanted into the brain, was the thought that I would one day become a doctor.
Wow, how amazing is that?
That was my very first goal, one of many goals that got me into really what I think is a most unusual and certainly unconventional career pathway for a doctor.
Absolutely, it is. And the admiration that you had for those doctors and nurses must have been all the more because they were working under very difficult circumstances.
They were working under appalling conditions. There was dust and debris and really, I hate to say it at this time in the morning, but there were dead bodies and bits of dead bodies. So they were working under very difficult conditions in makeshift casualty clearing stations. And they were doing a wonderful job. And I really admired that so much.
And so what is the route as a 6-year-old from there to actually achieving your goal?
Well, the first thing, of course, was to get into medical school. And I had already made up my mind by the time the higher leaving certificates and the requirements to get into university came along. It was still quite a challenge in a way because I had to get the necessary qualifications. But at that time, there were requirements for every young man to go in for national service. It was still on the run, that. And I had to go up for a very extraordinary medical for national service. But having got through that, the next route was up through medical school and to qualify in 1958. So it was a fairly routine and conventional route up to that point. It was really after I qualified that the first chance to do aviation medicine, which was my career choice, came about, and it enabled me to get started into as I say, there's a very unusual career of aviation medicine, and as you said earlier, into space medicine, broadcasting, and so on.
Amazing. Now, as a man who has a lowly private pilot's licence, aviation doctors always struck fear into my heart. Every time I had to go for the medical, they were quite ferocious, some of them.
Oh, I know. I for many years I was just that sort of doctor, and it's very difficult. One has to realise that a medical examination is a fearsome thing for anybody, but for somebody who relying on it for their work as an airline pilot or even for recreational flying, of course it's daunting. But I think on the whole we're not really as hard as we're made out to be.
No, of course not. And absolutely necessary, because I'm sure that members of the public don't really know that. I mean, as a commercial pilot, not only have you spent an absolute fortune in most cases getting your commercial pilot's license, but just one little box that's not ticked on your medical, it's over.
That's right. Well, it may be. We go to endless lengths, and I know the Civil Aviation Authority here will go to endless lengths to try and get people back into flying. But it is daunting, and it's a very worrying thing. I know two of my two of my sons were, in fact, airline pilots, so I knew exactly what they were going through every time a medical was due.
Wow. So your own work then, initially, that you're working in with the RAF, so what were you doing on a kind of daily basis so our listeners can get a picture of what you were doing?
Well, I was mainly at the Institute of Aviation Medicine at Farnborough, but I had spent really, shortly after my time of qualification as a doctor, I got the rare opportunity to have a civilian detachment to the Institute of Aviation Medicine at Farnborough. Now, that was unique because it was a highly sensitive, secret place, and there was a lot of work going on for pilots and aircrew during what was effectively a Cold War. And my work, when I first went down as a civilian, it started off, of course, until I got full security clearance, I was working in the Altitude Research Division. Now, the Institute was very much set up to look at the challenges to pilots flying high-performance aircraft up to very high altitudes. And at that time, the challenges really were quite severe. The air staff were hoping that we would get aircraft up to very high altitudes to beat the the surface to air missiles, which the Soviets had. And we were looking at ways, first of all, to protect them, to see what the effect of a loss of cabin pressure, for example, would have, how we could protect them. And most of my work, even at that time, for that year's civilian detachment and then on into the RAF during my posting to Farnborough, that was looking at ways of protecting them, what the limits were, how we could increase those limits, and testing them in our decompression chambers. And that took me really into what was quite dangerous experiments, which is why when I came to write my book, to realize that none of my family had any idea what I was doing.
And the people you were working with, I mean, you must have worked a lot with test pilots. These are brave individuals, aren't they?
Absolutely. I learned an awful lot from the test pilots. The test pilot school at that time was at Farnborough. It moved a little later on. And I used to be very interested in exactly how the test pilots carried out their flying, what techniques they used, and it was really from discussing matters with them that I was able to develop my own techniques for use both in conventional aviation, in space, and then latterly, which was my very final goal, was to apply everything that I had learned for aviation medicine and space medicine and apply it to everyday tasks and everyday jobs and occupations. But it was much of it came from the test pilots who have very, very, very tough job in testing aeroplanes before they come into service or if there's a change of role. And that change of role gave me the clue that what we were looking for in aviation medicine and what we were looking for indeed in occupational medicine was changes. What was changing that might have caused problems? So as you say, the test pilots really were an absolute boon. A very, very excellent bunch of men.
Absolutely. Now, you alluded to your career about space there, and those who sat up like me to watch the Apollo moon landings will recognise you instantly because you're on television all the time.
That's right.
How did that happen?
Well, it happened in a rather extraordinary way. In fact, I really didn't expect to get any involvement with space medicine, principally because the Institute and the RAF had far more things to do than to get involved in space, much as we'd have all liked to do that. But I was approached to take part in what was an international space rescue committee, and this was to see how we could rescue astronauts stranded in space. So I had done a lot of preliminary work, and although I had very little to do with the Apollo 11, where the men landed first, Neil Armstrong on the surface of the moon. And while interest, I have to say, in space and space medicine was dwindling, I was asked suddenly to go up to ITN House to advise on the catastrophe that had happened to Apollo 13.
Yes.
When they were something like 200 miles up into space, one of the oxygen tanks blew up, and they were really in a very serious state. Mission Control at Houston stopped the mission of actually landing on the moon, which of course was their intention.
Yep.
But they then set about seeing how we could bring them back safely, and that was a major challenge. My first reason for going up to ITN was to advise the news team really whether it was possible to mount a rescue. And the work that I had done for the Space Rescue Committee and Working Group showed that it virtually was impossible. Although there had been thought of sending up rockets similar to the Atlas rockets that were taking men to the moon, the practicalities of actually getting it up, getting a space rescue was impossible.
Right.
First of all, it couldn't catch up with the spacecraft traveling at 25,000 miles an hour. And even if it had done it, there would have been problems of docking and so on.
Yeah.
So what happened then was that we had a chat about this, and it became clear to ITN that there was no possibility of that type of rescue. But we set up a line to Houston in Texas and to Mission Control, and were really amazed at the work that they were doing. They set up a mock-up in one of their training space cabin spacecraft, and they worked out ways of getting the astronauts, keeping them alive, as it were, until they could bring the spacecraft safely back to Earth. And that was really an amazing piece of investigation and an amazing piece of rescue, if you could call it that.
Indeed.
They turned the lunar module into virtually a lifeboat.
Oh, dear.
But we went on the air. It was my first opportunity really to get into national broadcasting, and I welcomed it. And we set up a program, a special program, to follow what was happening to the astronauts as they set about trying to remain conscious, really, in space, and it was an incredible piece of work. And I have to take my hat off to the technicians and the engineers and the people at Mission Control in Houston for the work that they did.
How extraordinary. I mean, we're talking about test pilots being brave, but that is another level of brave, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. It's quite another level. But it shows how, and it demonstrated how important training was.
Yes.
Familiarization. How even in the direst of problems in the very hostile environment of space, if you're well trained, keeping calm, collected, and tackle the incident in a methodical and scientific way, you can get out of it. And it was really like something from Blue Peter, to be quite honest.
Of course.
They put together cobbled together a method of joining up their breathing system with a scrubber to take away the carbon dioxide that they were exhaling. They had enough oxygen, so they were all right. They had shut down the electricity, so they were freezing cold, and of course they couldn't